Hello, everybody. Christina Previtt here for the older adult edition of the PT on Ice podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful, wonderful week so far. Every time I do these podcasts, I can't believe that it's already Wednesday. And this week is super exciting because myself and 9 other PT on Ice Institute of Clinical Excellence faculty are going to be descending on Vegas and talking a little bit about our respective divisions and giving you guys a little bit of a sampler, hence the PT on Ice sampler, of some of the topics that we cover in our respective courses. Dustin and I, who kind of run the older adult division, we're going to be talking about the 3 F's of Jerry PT: fear, falls, and floor transfers. 3 topics that we thought were really, really important, and we're going to build on some of the content of the other divisions. So if you guys want to head over to Vegas this weekend, you should definitely do that. It's going to be a fun day. And then the next cohort for the APHPT starts right after Vegas. So on the Monday, April, I'm going to say 9th. I think it's 9th or 7th. Ooh, I think it's the 7th. That's the Saturday. Anyways, first week of April. So if you guys are interested, you should definitely jump on board with the APHPT. That's been a course that I've been trying to jump on with because I think it's definitely the way of our future. Okay, so today I've been kind of thinking a lot about frailty and clinical geriatric syndromes. It's kind of my job as a grad student to be thinking about frailty. And I started thinking about some of these ageist constructs that we've been talking about, how we're starting to, potentially stigmatize or create barriers for some of our older clients based purely on our own perceived thoughts around, what a person of X age is able to do, or making assumptions about a person's ability based on the year on their birth certificate. Extending past some of that, I started thinking about some of the labels we place on ourselves in regards to our health, and how sometimes, as much as we try to label or identify some of our older clients as frail, that it may not actually be the best way for us to do that. And here's why I'm going to explain. And as a disclaimer, I try to identify people along the frailty spectrum for my research. So I'm almost like questioning myself. And here's why I think that way. So when we are talking about labeling individuals with different health conditions, when we label somebody with a condition, one, we can talk about the pros and cons of slapping labels and diagnoses on everything. But when we do that with a medical condition, it usually triggers an action. So if we are going into the doctor's office, we get routine blood work done, and then all of a sudden your doctor says, oh, you have the criteria for diabetes. You now have type 2 diabetes. That label isn't just placed on you and then nothing happens, right? Usually that label is there to trigger a cascade of medical action. And so, you get that diagnosis, and then you start talking to your physician about potential medical management. There's potentially a referral to a registered dietitian who's going to help you with some of those lifestyle related conditions. In conjunction, you're probably going to have a little bit more follow-up. They're going to talk about some of the secondary complications of diabetes, such as things with foot care and neuropathies and things like that could develop if your blood sugar isn't kept under control. And so it cascades this action, this step-by-step process. The same is happening with heart disease. When we have diagnosis of heart disease, now we're going to be doing more routine blood work. We're going to make sure that our blood pressure and some of those cardiovascular risk factors are more under control. We're going to maybe more closely monitor our blood pressure, make sure that we're, within the given range. And so again, a cascade happens. And I was thinking about frailty. And so when a person is diagnosed as frail, we know that persons with frailty are at risk for more adverse health outcomes. So we know that all-cause mortality goes up for people who are frail versus not frail. We know that falls risk goes up. We know that risk of hospitalization or institutionalization goes up for people with frailty. So we know that there's these adverse outcomes, and it makes the argument that we need to identify people who are frail because we know that their outcomes may not be as good as those counterparts who don't have frailty. But the thing about this label is that nothing tends to happen after, and I may be being a little tongue-in-cheek and being a little facetious, but including in some of our physical therapy practice and all these screening tools that we use, if we are slapping a label on an individual, but we aren't actually using that information to drive our clinical practice, then why are we labeling that person in the first place? And so this was kind of the thought process that was going through my mind. And the reason why I started thinking about this is because often when we have some of these labels, they can become an identifier for us. How often do you hear somebody say, I'm going to go back to the diabetes example, I'm diabetic? That's a self-identifier, like you're identifying with that condition. And so if we are doing that same type of thing for a person with frailty, what are the associations that come with that? When we are thinking about the frail older person, we're often seeing people who are not doing very well, tend to be very ill or gaunt, just generally not in good health. So if we are labeling these persons as frail, but not actually doing anything to try and mitigate or optimize their medical management, are we just putting these potentially negative labels on individuals for no reason? And part of the issue with this, and is part of the way that we're continuing to build this literature, is that the first thing we had to do was try and figure out the optimal way. And I started thinking about this because Matteo Cesari published an amazing editorial in 2016 that talked about frailty and sarcopenia and the way that we should be conceptualizing this in order to act on the identification of these individuals in different healthcare settings. And this is where I think we need to go. So if we are going to label an individual as frail, then I think we need to take the next steps to implement changes in their medical care to make sure that we can either improve the symptoms of frailty, or we know that if the proper steps are taken, that we can actually reverse frailty to a certain extent and increase the functional resiliency of that individual, potentially increase their functional independence, and keep them with a higher quality of life doing things that they want to be doing for longer. So the first thing that people had to talk about was, how do we identify these individuals and what are we doing with them? And in previous PT on Ice podcasts, I've talked a little bit about some of the different ways that we conceptualize frailty. I've talked about Linda Fried's physical phenotype of frailty, Kenneth Rockwood's accumulations of deficits hypothesis. There's a study of osteoporotic fractures that tries to bring in a conceptualization of frailty. There's the Tilburg Frailty Index. So we have these validated measures, but the problem is, so we see that we have these measures, they correspond to increasing levels of frailty, and from that they're associated with adverse health outcomes. So that's kind of the line. But when we're comparing different frailty conceptualizations and operationalizations, for example, if we're comparing the study of osteoporotic fractures versus the Fried physical phenotype, the correlations between the two are actually relatively poor. And so what that tends to mean from a literature perspective and from a clinical application perspective is that we are identifying people who are at risk, but we may not be actually identifying the same people in these cohorts. So people who are identifying as frail through Linda Fried's physical phenotype of frailty may not be the same person that we are identifying with the Rockwood's accumulation of deficits hypothesis. And so if we're not actually conceptualizing frailty in the same way, then how can we use this information to guide clinical care applications and clinical care pathways? And that, I guess, at the bottom of it is where the problem has lied. And so if we are going to, as healthcare professionals, identify these individuals as frail, then we need to make sure that that label means something. We need to say, okay, well, if we've identified you as frail within our clinic, then our next step is to initiate X, Y, Z. And in my very biased opinion, that usually probably means optimizing nutritional management and placing individuals into an exercise program where they can be identifying where some of their issues are and making sure to try and increase the strength, resiliency, and balance of that individual to optimize their physical resiliency. So if we say, okay, we have an individual coming into our clinic, we're going to screen them for frailty. Say this is in primary care, so it's a nurse that's doing this screen. Then what we're going to do is, okay, they've been identified as frail, they're going to go into this pathway. We're going to identify as pre-frail, go into this pathway. And we can use this information to build a database that can follow these people over time and see if, that label is something that is going to improve outcomes rather than just identify a person who may do worse with medical management. Because when we just label somebody as frail and say, okay, well, we know that because this person is frail, they're, have all these negative things that could happen to them, what intrinsic biases are these starting to create in us as healthcare providers in terms of the amount of energy and effort that we put in? It may be subconscious, but if we're saying, okay, well, this person doesn't really have very good prognosis, are we going to put the same effort in as somebody who potentially doesn't have that diagnosis? And so I think that it's an important conversation to have. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek and being a little facetious with some of the things that I'm saying, but it really made me question myself and, kind of why I'm trying to identify these people before they've transitioned into frailty. And I think the most important thing for me was that it's not necessarily that I want to label a person across this continuum. It's that I want to optimize their medical care. And as a physical therapist, especially one who's really interested in the prevention side, if we can identify some of these subclinical manifestations of some of these clinical geriatric syndromes, then we can really try to implement the most optimal care for these individuals and follow them long term. That's not to say that people who are already transitioned into frailty can't improve. That's actually not what the literature is showing. And so I kind of wanted to get your guys' opinion about what you think about this. That diabetes label initiates medical interventions. What does that frailty label do? All right, that's it, guys. If you guys have any comments, put them below. This is just kind of where my brain is going, and I would love to hear from you guys. Start a conversation about this. Hopefully we will see some of you in Vegas this weekend. It's going to be much warmer than the flurries that are outside in Canada. And I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.